Okay, while we're waiting on some parts to arrive for other projects, I thought we'd take a look at this little guy. This is a Pilot FM tuner from about 1947, 1948. It's called a Pilotuner, and it covers the standard FM broadcast band that's still in use today. Its purpose was to add FM capabilities to AM-only receivers. You just plug the tuner into the phono jack or the auxiliary input jack of your existing radio, and voila, you have FM reception. So let's pull this thing apart and see what we can do to it. Hopefully won't be much wrong with it, and we're not going to just plug this in. The power cord is rather exposed here at the plug, if you will. Well, here's something unusual that I've never seen. Notice this chassis mounting hole, how it's intact. Notice this chassis bolt hole here, and notice how it's all broken out. In fact, that particular bolt wasn't even catching on to anything. Now, look at the inside of the cab. Notice this area of wood that got busted out somehow or another. And here are couple of chunks of wood that were laying inside of the set. I have no earthly idea how that happened, but it can be fixed. Here's our chassis, a 5-tube chassis with a power transformer, and it uses a selenium rectifier for the power supply. We have our RF amp, mixer tube, first IF tube, second IF tube, and detector tube. So should be a pretty decent little tuner once it's all fixed up. Here's the underside of the chassis. As you can tell, not much in the way of capacitors that need to be replaced. We have this electrolytic here, and I believe this is a mica bomb across the line capacitor here. There's our selenium rectifier, and there's a few paper caps in there, but not many. Here's our mica bomb AC line bypass capacitor. It's going to be less work involved in replacing this one because it wasn't even soldered to the terminal here. Yeah, this must have been one of those Friday jobs where they were in a hurry to get out for the day. But yeah, unlike on the Crosley video, I bet I don't get any accusations from anyone accusing me of unsoldering this capacitor before making the statement that I just made. Like I got on the Crosley video, someone accused me of breaking the belt on that record player, so I could tell everybody how crappy it was. Okay, I've replaced the power cord as well as the AC line capacitor, bypass capacitor. Yeah, this new capacitor is a good bit smaller than the old one. I have the DC voltmeter connected to the output of the selenium rectifier. I'm using the signal tracer as an audio amplifier so I can see if we're getting any audio output from the tuner. I'm going to fire everything up, monitor the B+ voltage, see if we get any desirable output here coming out of the signal tracer. Okay, we're only getting about 47, 48 volts off of the selenium rectifier, which is low. We're getting filter capacitor hum. However, I can detect that a station is coming through. Okay, so let's replace the filter capacitor here, and then we'll go from there. And checking the first section of this filter capacitor, it's supposed to be 40 microfarad. We're reading only 2 microfarads, and we can assume the other sections are just as bad. So, yeah, further proof that this capacitor is toast. Now, let me get creative and see how I'm going to mount the replacement capacitors. Okay, here's the old capacitor. We have two 40 microfarad sections at 150 volts, a 20 microfarad section at 150, and a 2 2 microfarad section at 150. Now that's the stabilizing capacitor in the detector circuit, and I don't believe you're going to need 150 volts there. A 50 volt capacitor should work fine. Looks like 296 is probably the source code. 737 is probably the 37th week of 1947. Well, unfortunately, we have a problem. I've replaced all of the filter capacitors, as you can see. And now when I fire it up, I get no stations at all. And this resistor is running very warm. One end of the resistor connects to the first filter capacitor. The other end of the resistor connects to the second filter capacitor, as well as some branches where DC goes in different directions. Well, checking at this end of the resistor, I'm reading, let's just say 500 ohms from the output of this resistor to chassis. Now that means that something is loading the circuit down somewhere. Now let's see what we have here. This resistor goes into this transformer here, which I believe is the discriminator transformer, or the detector transformer, whatever kind of detector this thing uses. Okay, and then we have another lead going back up here to this filter capacitor here. There's also a big mica capacitor connected between there and ground. And we have another B+ lead going back over here. And we have a resistor coming off of this tie point here. Well, it'll be easy to eliminate this problem. On this end of the resistor, we're reading the 494 ohms. And when I move to the other end of the resistor, right there, we're reading infinite resistance. So that tells you that our short circuit is not here. So we've eliminated one branch by this process of elimination. So now we need to check these other branches, and the only way to do that is unsolder each one at a time and make a resistance reading to chassis ground and see what the problem is. Okay, I now have all of our branches disconnected, so we will individually test each branch. We'll test this new filter capacitor. We'll test from this big mica capacitor to ground. We'll test from this red wire to ground and the orange wire to ground. And then we'll follow where the meter takes us. Okay, we're now checking from the red wire to ground. We're reading 494 ohms. And this red wire runs back up in here to the front end circuitry. Provides B+ to that stage. So, this is the area we need to investigate. Now let me mention one thing concerning resistors. Over the years I've had people ask me about a burning resistor in their radio. Well, I need a 470 ohm resistor. Mine keeps burning up. Well, just a little service hint. Anytime a resistor overheats, there's something causing it to burn up. Resistors just don't overheat and burn on their own. When a resistor burns, there's something that's drawing too much current through the resistor, which is exceeding its rating and causing it to burn up. So when you encounter a resistor in a piece of equipment that's overheating, you don't just replace the resistor unless you like smoking resistors unnecessarily. You need to find out what's causing the problem, and the way you do that is how we just demonstrated with the ohm meter. Look for an abnormally low resistance to ground, and then once you find it, correct the problem and then replace the resistor. Okay, our red wire comes around over to this terminal strip here, and on the meter you can see we're still reading a short, and coming off of this terminal we have several resistors. Here's a resistor here that one end connects to the terminal, the other end connects here. which connects to a capacitor, and the other end of this capacitor connects to ground, the chassis. So let's test right here. This ought to be a good point to test. And look at what we have, 0 ohms. What do you want to bet this capacitor has shorted? So let's unsolder one end of it and test it. Okay, there's one end of our capacitor cut loose. Let's check and see what we have now on the meter. We have infinite resistance. Now let's check at the capacitor. Come on, get on here. And look at that. This capacitor is dead shorted. Here's our capacitor out of circuit, reading dead shorted. Let's see what value this thing is, and hopefully I have one. Here's our capacitor replaced, a 0.01 microfarad. And look on the meter. No short. So let's hook the signal tracer back up and power it up again and see if we can get some reception. It would have to be better than what we had before. Well, that's a lot better.
AM WMER Meridian.
That's the FM simulcast at that station.
Come to another message on God, I need some answers. These are questions from the Psalms that are answered in the Psalms.
Bible class meets every Sunday morning at 9 in Magnolia Restaurant in Queen.
Country.
It's always uplifting and good music.
I listen to it almost all day.
97.0 KK.
The kind that carries all your love.
Friends say I was passed out on the dirty couch, still alive.
Call 21073.
I want to make sure every American is listening today. This is the Lord Larson Show.
Like a plane, let me guide that on the pilot.
Okay, well that sounds pretty sensitive. Now, that distortion might be due to this signal tracer, but we are going to go ahead and replace the rest of these little ticking time bombs. And that should help the situation a little bit, but I'm very pleased with the progress that we're making so far. A while back, when I ordered capacitors for my stock, I accidentally ordered some capacitors with extremely short leads, these things right here. For some reason, it didn't occur to me at the time that there are actually capacitors made with short leads on them. So what I do, in a situation where I don't need much lead length, as in this situation here, I use these smaller capacitors with the short leads. And in situations where I need extra lead length, I use the more traditional style capacitors that most everybody orders for their antique radio restorations, the capacitors with the nice long leads. So, you know, I don't believe in just letting parts just sit around unused. If I can figure out a way to use them, I'm going to use them. Okay, I'll replace the rest of the capacitors.
sales there. On the floor of the New York...
I'm always happy to help you choose the perfect rug for your decor.
Okay, tomorrow I want to hook this to a somewhat decent amp that will give me a little bit better fidelity than this signal tracer, and that'll give me a better idea of the current condition of this thing. And I'll clean the tube sockets to where they'll make better contact. I might even replace the selenium rectifier with a diode and kind of touch up the alignment, and this thing ought to be good to go. Okay, I think we're about ready to button this thing back up. I ended up having to replace the selenium rectifier because after it warmed up, the B+ voltage started dropping. So I just replaced the rectifier with a silicon diode, 1N4007, with a 27 ohm resistor ahead of the diode for surge current limiting and to drop the excess voltage. Okay, here we are back together, and I have it plugged into a little Coronado AC-DC set from the late 50s with a phono input.
I think that's as futuristic as Tomorrowland always is.
I would say late fall. And how
I will say this thing doesn't work too well when the tuner is not plugged into an isolation transformer. That's what I get when I have the tuner plugged directly into the AC line. I don't think that would be a problem if the tuner was actually plugged into a set, into a radio that contained a power transformer.
That's reportedly the most expensive single ever produced.
Which is what this set would be.
Well, the cost of making a single...
What this tuner would be plugged into.
$5,000. And it's unheard of for someone to spend twice that much to produce a single.
Would there be help for that, too?
Yeah. This kicking, so we're, you know, you do.
Now, I have not done anything to the alignment yet, mainly because I still haven't purchased an ink cartridge for my printer, and I want to be able to print the alignment instructions out and have them in front of me before I do that. But this thing seems to be working fairly well as it is, so, you know, an alignment is really not critical at this point.
AARP. Why would you wait
And I need to make up a proper shielded cable for the audio output of the tuner. We can't have this mess.
With the free 97 OKK Apple and Android app, now you can hear it.
Pretty much everything below 95 is either religious stations or public radio.
behavior is going to take you to a place that you don't want to end up.
Reach beyond. Hi, this is
Microphone.
Well, here we are.
But yeah, it seems to be working okay. Okay, I tried reversing the plug of the radio here, which has a hot chassis, and that still didn't solve the hum problem. So apparently this tuner does not like to be plugged into a radio or amplifier that uses a hot chassis, but like I said, that it's not a big deal because what I'm going to be plugging this into will use a power transformer, so shouldn't be a problem there. However, if I plug the radio with a hot chassis into the isolation transformer instead of directly into the non-isolated outlet, then it works fine. Okay, well that ought to do it. That's about all I've got for the Pilotuner for right now. Maybe one day, whenever I get the alignment instructions printed, we'll go back through it and do an alignment on it, but as it is, it works fairly well on local stations, and that's all I really need anyway. So thanks for watching, and more to come later.
Daytime I'm Mr. Natural, just as healthy as I can be, but at night I'm a junk.
Here's a plain Jane Zenith 5-tube AM radio from 1968, and the reason I know it's from 1968 is because of the model number, which is I'll get it where I can see it. Y114C. Now, Y is the prefix for the 1968 model year. Now, Zenith, like some other companies, was known to use the same design for several model years. So this radio is from the 68 model year, but the chassis number is chassis 5M04. Well, the M means that this chassis was first introduced in 1965. And I actually think there was a Zenith radio made prior to 65 that used this same cabinet. In fact, if you look at the tuning knob, it still retains these civil defense markings, which mostly went away by 64. So this is obviously a set that was a carryover, probably an attempt to use up old tube parts and chassis. So by 68, this was probably an entry-level AM radio. Okay, let's fire it up and see what it does. Give it a few seconds for the tubes to warm up. Sounds like the usual bad filter capacitor hum. Stations behind the hum, so after we replace the filter capacitor, it'll probably be okay. Okay, here's the chassis, and this set uses the type knobs that are captive to the cabinet. That's a safety feature, since this is a hot chassis set, meaning it has one side of the AC line connected directly to the chassis. And here's the underside of the radio chassis, fairly minimal construction. And the only capacitor we need to worry about is this filter capacitor can. Everything else is ceramic disc. We have this couplet here that's in the audio circuit. So let's replace this joker, and hopefully this radio will be good to go again. Okay, here we are. Red is 60 microfarad, 150 volt. Green is 20 microfarad, 150 volt, and it appears this is date coded the 240th day of 67. So yeah, this radio was likely made late 67, early 68 for the 68 model year. Okay, and this resistor in the power supply is brown, black, red, which equals 1,000 ohms. But we're reading 1.7 k ohms, so I think it might be a good idea just to go ahead and replace this resistor while we're in here. Okay, we have our filter capacitors installed in place. We soldered two modern individual capacitors to take the place of this honking thing on a terminal strip, which is soldered to the chassis. And since the chassis is used as circuit ground, I was able to use this lug as our negative tie point. I also soldered our original negative lead from the old filter capacitor here, just as an added bit of good measure. Here's our 1K ohm resistor that we replaced, and I think we're about ready to give it a try.
Retirement. They give you a tax
okay, there we are, bringing in 84 WHAS. So that tells me this thing is doing fairly well at bringing in distant stations.
Like they did in the 1940s.
And here we are reassembled. They had to kind of reposition the filter capacitors a little bit to accommodate the speaker, but everything fits.
It is correct. It is absolutely
here we are
correct.
Back together.
We measure this every day with a
Southern Belle. Feels so good all the time. Prior to
Be a young, middle-old black guy in America.
Like with anyone, anywhere in the world, you can share screens, you can review video conferencing.
And you and many times, personal being.
I thought for the rest of my life I would have to continue having surgeries. But now, everything is changing. Go to www.david.me.
there were some
That must be WSM. Yeah, that looks about right for WSM. Okay, well, I think that got it.
For a lot less money, you can drink Life Change tea that promotes your health and reduces...
Well, like they say, the best way to test a radio is to put it back together. If it's going to create a problem, then it'll wait till you have it all back together. As you can hear, with it turned down, we have a good bit of hum in the speaker. And with the volume turned up, we have distortion. That's completely unacceptable. So let's pull this apart and check some more things. Okay, we're back apart, and I think we have a gassy audio output tube. And the reason I believe that is because we're getting a positive voltage on the grid, on the control grid of the audio output tube. And the longer it warms up, the higher the voltage gets. We're getting about 5 volts positive on the control grid of the audio output tube. And that should be a negative voltage. It shouldn't be that much positive. Okay, here we are after more warm-up time. As you can hear, more distortion, and our control grid voltage on the audio output tube has gone up a little bit higher. Generally, that's what happens with these gassy audio output tubes. They'll sound reasonably well at first turn-on, and then they warm up and then rear their ugly head. So let's find a good 50C5 and see if that'll cure the problem. And if the tube ends up not being the problem, the trouble will most likely be the internal coupling capacitor inside of this couplet here. They don't go bad much, but it does happen. But first we're going to replace the tube and see what happens. Okay, here we are back together again with the good tube, and it seems to be playing fine.
WMER has you covered with severe weather at once, broadcasting live from Meridian, Mississippi. Good time Gospel Radio, 1390 AM, WMER Meridian. WMER. I'm gonna be moving on over, moving where? Moving over there to the 4th class.
better way to handle your finances, and it starts with a conversation at Community Bank.
Community Bank, like no other bank you know. Member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Temperatures will slowly climb as the week progresses.
The new Sean Hannity Show. More behind-the-scenes information on breaking news and more bold, inspired solutions for America.
All right, on this Monday,
And notice another thing that went away was that annoying background hum. Yeah, this tube was causing that too.
We will carry it live for our affiliates around the country.
Now there's our week station. So if it's coming in, I'd say this radio is doing about as well as can be expected.
In the state of Texas, indicted the government scheming with wildlife, and it's
was nearly 3 times the legal limit. To make matters worse for her, there's a videotape of her being abusive.
Okay, that ought to do it. The 1968 Zenith radio, ready to go for hopefully several more decades.
45 days in
Now, before I go, there's one caution I want to bring up. When you're replacing the chassis and speaker back into one of these types of plastic cabinets, do not go crazy over tightening the screws, because if you do, you're liable to crack the mounting studs. After this many decades, this plastic tends to become brittle, and those studs are very easily cracked. So when tightening those screws, be very careful and only tighten them enough to do the job. I can't tell you how many of these I've seen with busted mounting studs because of the plastic becoming brittle and people over tightening the screws, and it just cracks the studs.
Governor Perry have control over the 7.5 million.
Earn your business. Call me, C.W. Garrett, at 601.
Okay, there you go.
5963.
Thanks for watching, and more to come later.
917-2505.